Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of Breaking Through the Alissa Boyer podcast. I'm so excited to have Alissa Boyer as a guest. Alissa is a sensitivity coach. You might be wondering, what exactly is that? I thought the same, and it's actually pretty incredible what she does. What I learned is that Alissa helps people identify how they are triggered. It could be triggers at work, in a family setting, a relationship, or a friend group. Alissa teaches instead of being labeled as someone too sensitive or someone who takes things too personally, there really is a root cause to all of that. In this episode, she shares her journey through this work and how you can identify these triggers and learn to change your response. In her practice, she teaches people to embrace their sensitivity and use it as a strength in their lives. She is also a podcast host and the creator of several online programs, including The Sensitive and Soulful Vault and The Sensitive and Soulful Self-Worth. Alissa Boyer, welcome to Breaking Through. So happy to have you. I've been following you on Instagram for a while. And just like some of the stuff you post about sensitivity, I'm like, yep, that's me. So welcome. And if you can start by just kind of sharing who you are, what is it that you do? What does it mean to even be a sensitivity coach?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. So what I do is I support people who are highly sensitive. So I discovered the term highly sensitive person probably about 8 or 9 years ago. And being a highly sensitive person, you know, you're somebody who feels deeply, you're impacted by the world around you in ways that other people are not. And when I discovered this about myself, it was just like life-changing. It was like the missing puzzle piece that explained all of the things I struggled with in my life, why I felt so different. And so when I learned how to work with this and use it as a strength in my life, I was so passionate about spreading the word and helping others. So that's really what I do is I help people who identify as highly sensitive people learn how to work with it as a strength in their life instead of something that's like a liability or a burden. And my approach is really about empowerment, confidence, being your authentic self.
I feel like sensitivity oftentimes, or being highly sensitive, is like shamed because we think of it like someone going into the bathroom and crying because they don't know how to like regulate their emotions. But it's not, that's not it.
Correct. Yeah, totally. And especially in our society, you know, you hear like, get thicker skin, like stop crying, suck it up, toughen up. And so that's what we were all conditioned with for the most part. So it makes sense why a lot of people view it in a negative light. But the flip side of sensitivity and when you know how to work with it as a strength is, you know, it's the reason you're intuitive. It's the reason that you are empathetic, why you can have deep connections with people and you care so much. Like it has a lot of beautiful strengths to it, but you do have to learn how to work with the challenging parts of it, which is, you know, being more emotional, things like that.
Okay. So where were you in your life when you discovered this part of yourself?
So I had actually just moved to California. So I was born and raised in Minnesota, moved out to California almost 10 years ago. And I was in my first corporate job out of college, just kind of like figuring things out. And
what were you doing?
I worked in retail. So I worked for a corporate retail company in Orange County.
That's a stressful environment.
So it was very stressful. And I'm like a very driven person. Like if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do a great job. I also like needed to make money. Like I needed them to hire me because I started as an internship. I needed them to hire me. I needed to get promoted because it's not cheap to live here. And so I was just like in this fast-paced environment, like really trying to keep up with my coworkers who were coming in super early, working super late. And I started to develop really bad digestive issues where I got to a point where I could like hardly eat any foods. Like I was extremely sensitive to most foods and there was no rhyme or reason. Like it wasn't just gluten. It wasn't just dairy. It was like certain vegetables, like
you were literally sick to your stomach.
I was sick to my stomach and I was so anxious and stressed when I would drive to work because it was a really intense environment. And so I really started to struggle with those digestive issues to the point where I couldn't ignore it because it was impacting my life negatively. So, you know, started seeing different doctors. I was getting like endoscopies and, you know, taking like lots of Tums and Prilosec, like all the things that I could do, but nothing was really helping.
What were doctors diagnosing you with?
So they were like, oh, you know, maybe you're just stressed. Oh, like they didn't really have like a solid, like anything. Like, I don't know. I don't really see anything wrong. The only thing that they did see, one doctor saw was I had an ulcer in my stomach, which can be related to stress.
Right.
But even when I took medication to clear that up, still had the problems. Like I still could not eat. And I felt like I was like crazy because no one could see this issue, yet I was
so
sick.
profound for you.
So profound.
Yeah. And getting in the way of your job, your day-to-day life. And fashion, I feel like it's one of those industries where people who are very eccentric and kind of thrive on that nervous energy, right? So it's almost like you can be in that space and ignore how you're feeling because it's almost normal to, it's like we've all seen Devil Wears Prada.
Yeah.
So
literally,
it's like it's almost celebrated to be on your toes all the time because that's what the industry demands.
You're exactly right. I would compare it to like the Devil Wears Prada experience. And I was like a little girl from Minnesota, like, what is going on?
Yeah.
And like, when you're sensitive, like you're going to pick up on people's energy. So that nervous, frantic, everything's a fire drill energy, even though it's like,
what was happening to you at work that was triggering this physical reaction?
So it was a combination of things. One, it was like not taking breaks because I wasn't taking my lunch because I felt like I had to keep going and doing. I was also in a role that had a lot of visibility. So I felt like if I made a mistake, I could get in trouble. I could get called out, which was true. Like that would happen. So I felt a lot of pressure to not let anyone down. Plus I had a boss who was like extremely neurotic. And so his anxious energy would rub off on me. Like I would feel okay. And he would come to my desk and all of a sudden I was like derailed because he was so anxious. So it was like all of these things were adding up where I was like very hyper vigilant and on edge.
And I feel like that stays with you even when you go home.
It stays with you. I would wake up super early, like obsessing over projects, like started to have hair falling out. Like I remember looking in the mirror and I had like a quarter size, or maybe it was like a dime size, like bald spot on my part line. And I'm like, this is not okay.
And how old were you at this time?
I was 22 or 23.
Oh, wow.
So I was like young and I was just dating my now husband. And, I was just like in this place of like, I don't want to feel like horrible all of the time. And I did.
How long did that go on for?
It was almost a year of that.
So when did you kind of have that breakthrough moment where you realized this is not physical, it's more than that?
So there was a day where I was at work and I drank it was like an orange carrot juice, like something I thought would be fine to drink. And I got sick at work and I was like, there's like blood. And I'm like, okay, this is like got sick in the toilet really bad. Never had happened to me at work. And so I was like, wow, this is like a breaking point. Like I can't be at work right now. So I was like in tears. I never did this, but I was in tears. I went to my boss and I'm like, I have to go home. And so I went home and I started just like looking up doctors. So at this point I had learned that I had something called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, otherwise known as SIBO. I had tried antibiotics for it, but it didn't clear it up. I still had the same issues. So I was typing in SIBO doctor into Yelp. And there's this doctor that popped up in Orange County. And he was a holistic doctor. I had never gone that route, but I was just not seeing any progress with the traditional route. So I was like, whatever. I scheduled an appointment with him. You had to like go to this like seminar thing first, and then he would, you'd apply and he could see if he could help you. Mm-hmm. So I did all of that. I went to his office. And right away, I was like, oh my gosh, this feels so right. It was so tranquil. He had like astrology books, which I'm really interested in. And I'm like, okay, I felt like hope for the first time, like in, over a year.
Like there was an environment you can feel seen in.
Yeah. Yeah. And like he had treated people who had the same issues as me. And so I started seeing him. And right away, he was able to tell me I had adrenal fatigue because I was so anxious and stressed all the time that it was like causing me to burn out my adrenals. So I was like, my arms would get tingly sometimes because I just like wasn't absorbing nutrients properly. I had SIBO. I also had something called leaky gut. And what I learned from him was, yes, I had to go on a specific diet to clear up what was happening in my stomach, but I had to go on specific supplements. But a huge part of it was the emotional trauma, healing, and learning how to manage my stress. And I was so stressed and taking on so much because I was so sensitive. So it was like all kind of adding up to what it became.
And how did you feel knowing that you were essentially doing this to yourself? What was that like in that moment of realization?
It was like, honestly, there's a sense of relief, because it made me feel like I had some power over it rather than, oh, this is just happening to me randomly. It was like, oh, there's like something I can do about this now. And it felt like it was kind of a missing piece for me where I was on the path to discover things about myself that I had never like looked at before.
What was that first step in making the connection?
So for me, in my sessions with my doctor, he would do this like muscle testing where basically he could kind of identify if there was like a subconscious issue that I was holding on to that was impacting the way that I was showing up in my life that was causing stress. So an example of this is because I'm like such a high achieving person, go, he looked at, why are you like this? Like, what is driving you? Because I was doing it from an unhealthy place to the point where I was making myself sick. And we made a connection where when I was a kid, I have a younger brother who's like super smart, like book smart. And I would always compare myself to him. He's more easygoing, not sensitive. And so there is this part of me that's always trying to prove myself, hey, I'm smart too. Hey, notice me. Look at how much I can do.
Wanted to be seen.
Wanted to be seen. And so I was doing it from this unhealthy place of wanting to be seen, feel safe, fit in. And so making that connection alone was huge because just having that awareness, like, oh, this is my tendency. This is why I'm doing it. Okay, I don't need to keep doing it this way. So that was like a huge unlock for me. That was life-changing.
How did you connect that to being overly sensitive?
So that was around this time I started getting into personal development then and like meditation and things like that. And so when I was reading a bunch of like self-help books, my mom discovered the book, The Highly Sensitive Person. So it's called Highly Sensitive Person, written by Dr. Elaine Aron, which is the woman who founded it. And my mom's like, hey, this book sounds like you should read it. I read it in like a weekend and I was like, oh my gosh, this totally describes me. And so what I learned from that book and how I found the connection was that when you're a sensitive person, a lot of times you feel so different and you feel like you have to prove yourself and shapeshift in order to fit in and feel good enough. And so I was like exhibiting all of those behaviors. Plus being sensitive, you're absorbing more of people around you. You're going to, you're going to get more depleted by fast-paced environments. Like you can do it, but if you don't have the skills or ways to cope with it, eventually something's got to get. And so I made that connection. It was like, oh, this explains everything.
Yeah, I can totally relate. I mean, I've always felt like I was an empath and someone who is, I wouldn't say highly sensitive, but definitely sensitive enough where I felt like the thermometer in the room. Yeah. If it's getting too hot, then I got to cool it down and vice versa. And I kind of have to, and that breeds like people pleasing and all that stuff. And that's just like, it's, a whole other cycle. So when did you realize that you can do things to kind of reverse that?
Yeah, so it was definitely through working with my holistic doctor that I recognized like, okay, there are some ways to mitigate the impact of being highly sensitive. So just through working with him, the first thing I got into was meditation because I knew I was so anxious and on edge and stressed every day that I needed to have some sort of practice that could calm my system. And so that was the first thing that I really recognized. And I started out small.
How did you get into meditation?
Yeah, because it's a thing.
So many people have no idea how to meditate. I sat my mom down to meditate and she like just sat there for a few minutes, closed her eyes. And I can tell she's like already her mind's somewhere else, And then my 7-year-old son, 8-year-old rather, did a 17-minute guided meditation with me. And he's like, gets totally into it. So it's like, I think everyone's like on a spectrum of their ability to meditate. So how do you get someone who's never done it? Because the common thing that I always hear is, well, how do you turn your brain off?
Right.
So how do you?
Yeah. So I first think people need to understand that it's normal that your brain's going to keep going and that you can't go into it expecting, okay, my mind's just going to be completely shut off right away and I'm going to be great at it. Like, I don't think people try for long enough to get the effects. They try like one or two times.
Months and months.
It takes months and months. It's like a compound effect.
Yeah.
And the reason I found it was working was the times that I didn't do it, I noticed a difference. I'm like, oh, this works. So I think people need to go into it with an open mind, knowing it's not like a quick fix. It's something that adds up. It's a process. And starting small, like however small you can start so that you can be consistent with it is key. So like for me, I started with like walking meditations and driving meditations, eyes are open. And then I worked my way to seated, like eyes closed. And that worked well for me where it was like low pressure. And then it's just kind of builds from there. But if you go into it with this expectation, like, oh, I'm going to be totally Zen right away, like it's just not the case for a lot of
not at all.
people. Yeah.
I started meditating about a year ago.
Okay.
And now I crave it. I'm like addicted to it. Every day I have to meditate. And even if it's like for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, I try to go like a full 30. And for me, it helps to play specific type of music. I close my eyes. In the morning, it helps. And to be sitting still, to have my hands at each side. And then, yeah, you keep telling your brain like, okay, just block that out, block that out, block that out. You have to do that until you get to a point where you're not telling your brain to do that as much because you're learning now to calm your mind rather. And then always, I don't know if this happens to you, when I close my eyes, I see like this invisible horizon. And I let my like subconscious kind of go into that. And then it's like I'm in this trance.
I love that.
It sounds hokey, but you know, if you're into the practice,
you get it.
You get it.
Absolutely.
And so what did you learn in meditation and how did you apply that to sort of understanding your sensitivity issue better?
For sure. So I learned through meditation that I can create space between something happening and my response to it.
So pausing the moment.
And before I got into meditation, I just believed everything I thought, would go right into a reaction, you know, oh no, this happened. This is the worst thing in the world. But through meditation, it like created more space for me where it was like, okay, I don't have to like go into this response. I could have a pause, a moment for awareness. I could see more clearly my own patterns. So a lot of that, like the people pleasing, the overachieving, like I could witness myself wanting to go into my old patterns, but choose differently, choose a more empowered way. So that's what meditation really gave me, was that power to like pause and check in, and also just a deeper connection with myself and my intuition, which has strengthened my self-trust. Because when you know you can listen to yourself and rely on yourself, it's so powerful. And a lot of times we're just like outsourcing everything to everyone else and feeling like, oh, I don't, you know.
We're calling people for confirmation, for opinion, but really it's that self-trust that's so important.
Exactly. And what I tell sensitive people is you have access to a powerful intuition. Like when you're highly sensitive, you're attuned to the world around you. You have a lot of times do have that urge to have like a spiritual practice, a deeper connection to something, you know, higher than yourself. But a lot of times sensitive people are shut off to that because they're so wrapped up in other people, in you know, trying to keep up, that they literally don't even access it.
Right. I feel like when we're younger, it's really hard to tune into our intuition, but it is a practice. And so what's your advice to someone who's trying to understand how to listen to their intuition? Because oftentimes it's like that fearful voice might come through as intuition, but intuition isn't fearful.
Correct. Yeah, totally. I mean, so first, definitely cultivating a stillness practice, meditation, that will help you become more in tune with yourself. Something else I like to tell people is to kind of notice the times in the past throughout your life where you have had an intuitive nudge, a feeling about someone, a situation, you did something that you're like, I don't know if this is going to work. And it did. Like kind of like make a list of those times and look back at it, because that will help you build confidence and like, oh yeah, I actually have done these things. And, you know, there is a little bit of proof. But then from there, in terms of like moving forward in your life and being able to tune in, I always tell people, because I'll always ask, what's the difference between anxiety and intuition? To me, it's like, okay, if you have an opportunity, like let's say to take a job and you're like, it's like perfect on paper, but then you tune in with yourself and there's like a constriction in your throat or your chest or something just feels heavy or off, you know, maybe that's not the right choice. Whereas something where it's like, your intuition is guiding you and it's saying yes, you'll often feel more expansive, like you can breathe easier, like, ooh, you know, there might be a little bit of give you more energy, a thrill. There might be a little bit of fear, right? Like, oh, I'm kind of nervous, but it will feel more like expansive in your body, but you have to give yourself space to actually tune into that.
Right. What other tools did you use to sort of understand the sensitivity in the workspace specifically? You're saying to slow down. When you mention this, I think of someone very specific. I have a good girlfriend named Karen, and she's, I think, a very sensitive person. And so she'll get rattled up about things that, you know, she's so smart and she has this huge job for this huge company. But sometimes she'll just get so affected by it. And it's like, what would you tell someone like her? Like, how do you reel that back in?
Right.
And just maybe like not taking everything so personally.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big one. So it's like a twofold thing. One, it's so important to have the self-regulating practices. So like a meditation practice, a journaling practice, something where you start your day in a way where you're anchored into yourself before you're like going out into the world. I always tell my clients, you need to like put your armor on for the day. Like the rest of the world is not as sensitive as you. So you have to have ways you pour it into your cup to kind of like make deposits into your bank account. So when the world is like crazy, you have some withdrawals, but it's not like you're depleted. So that's like the number one thing, having those practices. But also then what's essential is knowing why you have a tendency to take things personally, knowing why you have a tendency to go into people pleasing and understanding that deeper root. You can't really self-regulate your way out of those deeper issues. So like in my case where it was like, oh, I'm trying to overachieve because I want to, feel important. I had to know that in order to make that change. A lot of times people take things really personally. It's a huge issue for highly sensitive people, HSPs, because they're insecure. There's a part of them that feels insecure. And so when we think, oh, everyone's looking at us, oh, they said it to us that way because they don't like us or they're so mean. A lot of times it's hitting on one of our insecurities and one of our wounds, when the fact is they're probably not thinking about us that much. It most likely is not personal. A lot of times we're making a situation personal because we're like, oh, it reminds you of a time when you were a kid and you got, your coworker isn't as friendly to you in the hallway, let's say. Maybe it reminds you of a time when you were a kid and you got left out. And so anytime there's something that feels similar, you take it personally.
Because there's probably a hidden trauma there.
A hidden trauma.
My people pleasing came from like fear of abandonment.
Right.
But I didn't realize that until I was much later into my adulthood,
Yeah.
So it's like these things click eventually. So when did it click for you that you wanted to leave the fashion business and make this sensitivity coaching your now job, essentially?
It definitely happened organically. So I started like talking about my experience as a highly sensitive person in 2019, just like blogging on the side of working full time. I ended up going to a different company, which was great, still in the fashion industry, but just started blogging on the side 2019 and then really just kept at it. And my following on Instagram really started to grow. And I started just
you have like 150,000 highly sensitive people following you.
It's crazy.
There's a lot of us out there.
There are. It's so wild. Yeah. So that started happening. And I'm like, okay, I guess this is like a thing. I started a podcast. I started doing coaching and creating courses. So it kind of organically evolved. And then it became what I do full time in August of 2022. After I had my daughter, it's like, okay, I think, this is going to be what I do. So it evolved, but it was so divine. Like it just unfolded very naturally.
And do you feel like becoming a mom made you more sensitive, or did it help you kind of check yourself more?
It definitely made me more sensitive. And it's really interesting because so many women will reach out to me after they become moms. And that's when they realize they're highly sensitive because it's so intense.
Their hormones, I feel like, also bring everything to the surface.
Yeah. And all of the triggers and your past trauma, like all of it comes up as a
New mom judgment.
Totally.
All of that. It's a scary place. I've been there.
It's very scary. Yeah. And for me, it was like before
I feel like there should be free therapy for new moms for like 2 years.
1,000%. It is so jarring. And I found it really difficult. So it was like before I became a mom, I'm like, oh, I've got this figured out. I feel good. I could have all the time to meditate and do my thing. And then I had a baby and I was like, wow, this is crazy.
You have no time?
No time. And I had to find ways to not, fall apart. But becoming a mom made me a stronger coach for highly sensitive people because I really was like tasked with like, okay, how can I still feel as good as possible while having a lot less time and energy? Like, how can I still pour into myself? And so it's strengthened my message and my, the foundation of the work that I do because I've shown myself like, okay, I can still feel good. I can still pour into myself in different ways, even when it doesn't look how, it might ideally look for a highly sensitive person.
Right. And what are some of the issues people bring up when they're seeking coaching?
There's a ton of feeling responsible for everyone else, kind of like the people pleasing where they're so impacted by other people's mood problem energy. So it's like they feel responsible for fixing their husband's mood if he kind of comes home from work and he seems a little bit quiet. They're like, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And they're like stressing over it or overthinking like their friend's text message, like, oh my gosh, is she mad at me?
Okay, so you gave 2 really good examples.
Yeah.
What would your advice be to those examples? Because you still want to be a caring wife, but how do you find that balance?
So like on the wife one, because I deal with this, something I repeat to myself is like allow someone else to have the dignity of their own experience. Like another adult,
I love that.
Yeah, is capable of having their own experience. They can be in a bad mood or feel a little off or be a little stressed, and it doesn't automatically mean you did something. A lot of times it's not. And if you keep asking, it's going to create a problem. Been there.
And sometimes men just want to be left alone. They need to go into their cave to figure it out.
Yes. And it's not personal. Just give them the space. And so I tell people, like, you have to sit with the discomfort of someone else having an experience and not make it mean anything about you or that you need to go fix it. And that's
so
actually right. And that's where you have to use your sensitivity, like your attunement to others. Like it can actually be a strength when you get out of your own way. So like, because I'm attuned to other people, I can tell when my husband just needs a moment of silence to be by himself and I don't have to make it personal. So, disconnecting from that. Or like with the friend example, a lot of times we're quick to take it personally. Well, what if your friend is busy running after her kids or she had a bad day at work? Like we automatically assume it's about us. It could be about us.
Yeah.
If that happens, I always say, okay, I think we can survive that though.
And especially nowadays, because we're all texting and there's no tone in text. I have some friends that if I don't put like 5 happy faces, they're like, is something wrong?
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I'm just busy.
Exactly.
I'm sometimes very matter of fact. And I think it's because of my work, I have to get answers out really quickly. And someone would be like, why are you being so aloof? I'm like, I'm not, I swear. I'm happy. I promise. I'm not mad at you. and this is coming from a sensitive person, but it's like, we take so much out of context.
Exactly. Like assume the best until you know otherwise,
right?
Rather than creating a story around it and ruining your whole afternoon when probably nothing is wrong. And if something is wrong, I always say you can handle it. You can figure it out. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah. Giving something space is so important. I used to be pretty reactive too myself. And I think that just came from immaturity. And now if I feel like I don't know how to respond to something, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to think about this. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Right.
And then when I sleep on it, usually in the morning, it's like a better answer. And that's fine. I feel like, especially now with technology, we have the ability to reply back so quickly and be in each other's lives in an instant, right? You can FaceTime and be a part of someone's life or that moment. But actually taking the step back and letting that call go to voicemail or whatever is totally fine.
For sure. Yeah. And that's like,
that's how you slow down time.
Yes.
Just like taking that pause.
Absolutely. And that's something that a lot of the people I work with, like, will have to talk. I will talk to them about where it's like they have these emails to respond to or these texts, and it's like allowing yourself to sit in the discomfort of taking some space rather than feeling like everything is urgent and, oh my gosh, I need to like figure this out right now. Because it's like if you're not in the headspace, you're not going to show up in the way that you want anyway. So
what's like the timeline? I'm curious, someone who comes to coaching, what's the process of the coaching? Like how long does that take? And how do you kind of guide them through this experience?
So we'll usually do anywhere from like 1 month to 3 months. But, I have some clients I've worked with for almost a year who just like to have continued support. So it looks different for everyone based on where they're at. But what we're really doing is focusing on a few key areas of their life that they're really wanting to change the most. So, one of my clients, she came to me and she was having a really difficult time with a family member where that family member was very dominating and would just trample her boundaries. And my client was so soft-spoken and was like so nervous about speaking up and didn't trust herself. And so that process looked like, okay, why don't you trust yourself? Because in order for you to speak up with confidence and be able to kind of stand on your own with somebody who is so dominating, you have to have trust in yourself and in your voice. So that was what we looked at first. Whereas, what are the deeper issues that are stopping you from using your voice? And then it looked like kind of at first like developing some scripts, some go-to things that she could say to, text this person and feel confident and have a productive conversation.
I'm like so curious.
Yeah. So for this person, her family member would get like really triggered and reactive. And so we had to have some set responses that she could say if it got kind of volatile, where it's like, okay, I'm not going to continue this conversation if you're raising your voice with me. I'm going to walk away. Like, so having these things, because in the past, she would completely avoid talking to the person and like leave the situation because she was so intimidated. So being able to just like stand her ground and have that as like a set thing she could say if it got to that point was huge. The other thing that we talked about too was how to express your opinion and your needs without pointing the finger at the other person. Because a lot of times, if you have a difficult conversation you need to have, if you feel like you're like, you did this to me, the other person's automatically on the defense. But if you can say, I feel this way when you do this,
right,
or when this happens, they're less defensive. So it was like little things like that where we could talk it through.
Yeah, boundaries are so important. I also had Terry Cole on this podcast, and she's like the boss of boundaries.
I was on her podcast. She's awesome.
She's amazing. And, I'm sure you know some of her quotes. She says that boundaries are like showing the world your guide on how to love you. I'm sure I'm like butchering that, but more or less that's essentially what it is, right? It's like, how can someone really truly love you and know who you are unless you set those boundaries? And it's gentle boundaries. It's not like coming at someone like, do you know who I am and what I stand for? No, it's like saying, excuse me, but I would really like it this way.
Yes.
And if someone is willing to honor that, then they're showing you, right? They're how much they're willing to show up for you. And I feel like sometimes when we do in little ways stand up for ourselves, like saying, I'm sorry, but you can't talk to me in that tone. Please don't speak to me that way. It's like, it's almost so empowering to you that you are able to say that without running away, without feeling abandoned, without feeling like you're losing a part of yourself, and it's like people don't not leave when you say that. People don't run away. And if they are going to, then let them.
Exactly.
So you're so amazing. I love everything you're saying. And it's so easy to see how you naturally came into this, just the way that you explain everything. One of the things that I see on your social media that I love is like this concept you have of being the good girl. Explain that.
So being the good girl is something I've just seen pop up so much with myself and with so many of my clients. So it's really this highly sensitive woman specifically who is feeling like you have to do things perfectly, like you have to be responsible for everyone around you. So their mood, their well-being, making all of the appointments, scheduling the dinners, like you're on top of everything. You're like the A+ student. You always say and do the right thing. The good girl also tends to feel really guilty. It's like the person who you're getting your nails done and the water is too hot. And you will never say anything, even though you're burning up, because you don't want to be a burden or be needy, So it's that person who's so fixated on other people's perception that you will abandon yourself over and over and over again because their perception of you matters more than your perception of you. And it's really like a safety. It's a way that you keep yourself safe. It's a way that you avoid conflict. A lot of times, we develop that because, we were hypervigilant as kids, or we were praised for being anytime we were quiet, or we learned that if we spoke up and we were too sensitive, that wasn't liked, that wasn't appreciated. So we developed this opposite kind of persona where it's like, okay, I'm just going to do things perfectly and not upset anyone. And I'm going to slide under the radar. And then I'm not going to have any conflict.
But that's not sustainable.
Exactly.
Do you feel like that gets to a boiling point where you're just like, I'm done?
1000%. And
because I feel like you've reached that boiling point.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So it's like, chronic health issues a lot of times can be related to this because there's a lot of women then who are suppressing their feelings. Oh, I can't feel angry. I can't show frustration. I have to stuff it down. That's really hard on you. Carrying all of the responsibility, trying to manage everything and make sure everyone's happy and worrying about every text. Chronic stress, chronic anxiety really adds up and impacts your body. And you're not going to have relationships that feel fulfilling if you are never expressing yourself. If you're always just answering the phone for your friend who has a million problems but doesn't ask how you're doing, that's going to make you feel resentful. That's going to make you feel lonely, frustrated. So those are just some examples. Plus, in the workplace, if you're obsessed, you don't have boundaries and you just take on every project and you never take a lunch break like I used to do, again, you're showing yourself, I don't value you. Making other people happy and comfortable is more important than you. So all of this adds up and eventually it gets to a point where it's having the opposite effect. You're being the good girl because you want to have good relationships with people. You want to feel important. You want to get the raise at work. But what ends up happening is people are respecting you less sometimes, unfortunately, because you're not carrying yourself with respect.
I'm really curious, what's like the demographic of your clientele? Is it more, because I feel like they come to you probably when they already have like a little bit of realization already. So it's like, when does that breakthrough happen? And is there a commonality between like age or, more with women? And can you kind of share some of that information?
For sure. So I mean, in general, just so people know, like high sensitivity impacts both men and women equally. Like there's all people can be highly sensitive, but the people who are attracted to me and I tend to work with, I would say they're like late 20s at the youngest, and then more like 45, 50. So it's like, that's kind of the range. I have had some people in their 60s. A lot of people are discovering it later in life because it was only high sensitivity only was like talked about in the early 1990s. So it's like a newer discovery. But yeah, so it's a lot of women 30s and 40s, I would say.
I really wish women like my mom's generation would discover this. I have a girlfriend, her mom is such a beautiful person, but also very highly sensitive. She spent her whole life being a full-time mom and a full-time daughter-in-law and a full-time wife, catering to everyone, totally neglecting herself. And she has some of the exact stomach issues you have. And she's in her 60s.
Wow.
And to this day, I think she struggles. And I wish that she could find someone like you, because it's huge, especially in certain, the immigrant experience. I feel like so much we're focused on survival, and for women taking on that role of caretaker where it's like, I'm going to allow my husband to be the breadwinner, so I'm going to take the burden on. And these are all very noble things. And I commend these women, especially, and men, of course, for taking it on, because the intention is good. But I think that realization of this is really hurting me is such a huge breakthrough.
Yes, it is. It's so important to make those connections. And, I think a lot of times because of how so many of us were raised, it's like you just don't want to burden others with your needs. You don't want to put anyone out. So you put yourself last and you put yourself last, you put yourself last. And eventually it adds up. And, some people keep trudging along and they will go, their whole life with feeling unseen and having these health issues or whatever that looks like. But, when you're sensitive, I always tell people like, it's hard because you can't get by with just neglecting yourself because your body will tell you in some way or another. Like it's just going to happen. And I say that that's actually a gift. Like it's hard, but that's a gift because you are forced to get to know yourself better. You're forced to have an introspective practice and take better care of yourself. Like that's ultimately a wonderful thing that people who are less sensitive may not ever have to do because they can just kind of get by without being impacted.
And I feel like this is still a relatively new concept. Do you find that people come to you with like a sense of shame or guilt that they are even seeking out help or for being a sensitive person? Because I'm sure anyone who's sensitive probably is beating themselves up a lot.
Majorly. Yeah, that's like a shame and guilt. A lot of shame, though, is something we focus on in the work that I do with highly sensitive people because they internalize messages that they often heard from other people. Oh, you're too sensitive. You're too much. Stop being so dramatic. Quit being a crybaby.
That's a big one. Stop being so dramatic.
Right. And so anytime they have a feeling about something, they, that voice is often in their heads. And so they feel bad about how they're created, and feeling guilt and shame about not being able to like keep up with people can be hard too, where it's like, as a sensitive person, you tend to need a little bit more rest. You tend to need more downtime. You need to nourish yourself better. You need to like be more thoughtful about certain things that maybe other people don't need to be. They actually will, I forget who said this, but it's like a researcher, will call highly sensitive people orchids, where you need very specific care. But when you do that, you will thrive and bloom, versus people who are not sensitive are more like a dandelion, can thrive in any environment. It's easy for them to be thrown in and be okay. And so just kind of understanding like, that's like kind of how I help people reframe it.
And do you ever feel or see that the sensitivity then leads to that person being overly angry? Because I oftentimes will witness people who can't, control their emotions. They get really worked up. They get, almost like I want to say in a shouting match, right? Does that come from also being very sensitive, or is the origin of that different?
So yes, there can be a connection. There's actually, to me, that sounds like hypersensitivity versus high sensitivity. And I actually—
What's the difference?
Yeah. So I actually wrote an article about this years ago. So hypersensitivity is going to stem a lot of times from trauma and from having experiences where, you were made to feel small, your needs didn't matter, which can also happen to a highly sensitive person.
So now you want to make yourself big to be heard.
Exactly. And so a hypersensitive person is reactionary, triggered, going to go off, not really thinking at all about how their reactions will impact others. And a lot of highly sensitive people who've had, traumatic experiences and struggles might fall into that category. But a person who— you can be highly sensitive without being hypersensitive. So a highly sensitive person that's healed, that knows how to be regulated, can feel frustrated by something without going into that reactionary mode. So that's more of the hypersensitive, where it's like, you made me feel small, now I need to make you feel small kind of thing.
I have so many questions because this is like so interesting. Okay, so I feel like some people, also critics of this type of practice and work, might be like, well, that's so self-indulgent. I don't have time to think about that. I don't have time to worry about that. What do you say to people like that? And, is taking on coaching with someone like you expensive, or, how do you frame that?
For sure. I mean, to me, I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, if I can feel better in my day-to-day life, I'm going to show up better for everyone else, as a mom, as a wife, as, a person on the street. Like, I'm just nicer, and other people benefit, like, when you feel good about who you are. And so it only can benefit others as well.
Yeah.
But in terms of investing, if we're working together one-on-one, it's definitely more of an investment. But I also have a podcast and so many free resources for people, because I want this information to be available for people where they can discover things about themselves and learn tips and ways to thrive. But to me, it's like, okay, if you want to live a life where you feel more peaceful and regulated and not so on edge and anxious, then it's essential to look at yourself and look at the part you are playing in the way you're experiencing life.
Right. And I feel like you have to really want that help for yourself. And do you find that people who are brought into self-help, whether it's therapy or when they're seeking you out, when they're brought into it versus when they come themselves, what's the success rate?
So if somebody feels if somebody's not ready, or they want you to save them, it's just never going to work. I have found that time and time again, when I've had people that are like, they want to be fixed, it's not going to work, because you are outsourcing your power. And the way that I see people thrive, the way that I teach thriving as a highly sensitive person, is about taking personal power, looking at your role in things and looking at why you're getting triggered, looking at your deeper wounds, regulating yourself, doing all of those things. And to be willing to do those things, you have to be somebody who is willing to look at some hard stuff and be vulnerable. And not everyone is ready for that. And that's okay. Sometimes it can feel easier to say, everyone else is the problem. Everyone else is mean and bad. And there are those people out there, but those aren't the people that I speak to at the end of the day. Cause I'm like, I want to work with people who want to feel good and who want to make an impact. So,
well, hopefully, I hope everyone can kind of take that step and look at themselves. So what does being a successful now sort of graduate of this sensitivity school look like for you? How do you see yourself reacting differently to things?
I just have this mindset of, everything that happens to me that's a challenge, there's an opportunity. I literally don't find myself getting too frazzled. I mean, obviously I have hard moments like everyone does, but I always am able to shift into, what's the opportunity here? How am I growing? How is this serving me? And so that has allowed me to just enjoy my life more, because I'm not really getting so hung up on oh, this person said this to me and, oh, my feelings are hurt. Or, I get people online that are so mean and inappropriate sometimes. That just happens, but it's not something that keeps me down or makes me stop like it would have in the past. And I just see how, when you're a sensitive person who isn't ashamed of being sensitive and you share your empathetic nature, it just uplifts others, and it gives other people permission to be that way, rather than walking around in the world with this mask on, pretending we're perfect and have it all together.
Your sense of discernment just sharpens so much. Yeah. And for me, that really happened when I let go of sort of the expectation of things, and just saying, there's a lesson to be learned here. It's not about what happened. I can't take that personally, but all I can do is kind of like take in this lesson.
Right.
And, I'm going to do differently the next time. And that's so empowering too. And you don't feel as sensitive because now you feel like my sensitivity is just like, it's now like a superpower in a sense, right? Because I'm able to read the room and feel the room, but I'm not internalizing it.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like life isn't just happening to you. You have a sense of power in how you react and respond to it, which positively impacts the way you walk through life. It's not like, oh my gosh, people are so mean. It's like, I'm good either way.
So how can people find you?
So I'm most active on Instagram at Life by Alissa. That's probably the main way. I have a podcast, The Sensitive and Soulful Show, which is like all over. Those would be the main platforms.
And do you plan on doing this forever? What's the next step for you, the next breakthrough?
So definitely plan on doing this forever as long as I can see. Definitely wanting to just keep expanding my reach and putting myself in, challenging situations, to help me grow.
Mm-hmm.
Going to write a book. That's like the next thing I'm like slowly working on.
Yeah.
So that's a big one for me.
Yeah, you should. I mean, you have this aura of a good girl. I'm not, but at the same time, you are so, you speak with so much conviction and it's like you are this powerhouse of like this positive message. No, I love it. And it's like, you don't expect that from like the good girl. You know what I mean? Someone who's like super sensitive, but it's so beautiful that you've gone through this transition and now you're like sharing this message and actually helping people. So
I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's so fun.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Breaking Through with Alissa Boyer. For our community to grow, please like and share and also leave a review on this episode. Of course, you can find me on social media and let me know what you'd like to talk about in future episodes. Nothing is off limits, so let's have some fun.